Okay. So we are recording now, just for reference. I do also have the meeting chat up, so if you have any questions, you want to just pop those in the chat, no problem. Go ahead and do that as we go. I'll try to either work it in or address the questions at the end. So what we're going to be talking about today, it's going to be a relatively short session today. I want to highlight a couple of new reports that we've developed. These are also reports that I think we're going to be working on an ongoing basis. So if you have some additional features or other thoughts or upgrades that we can do on them, please let me know after you have a look. So these are reports where we're helping you calculate what your time to 90% success is for certain metrics dealing with response time and potentially response personnel on scene. So one of them is an enhancement to an existing report, which is the one called the um, apparatus response time comparison report. And the other one is an entirely new report, which is called the response time requirements report. So the two reports do slightly different things, but they do have some similar basic functions in terms of determining whether the department has hit certain response performance benchmarks, and also then telling you what it would look like or how much time it would take to get to 90% success on those benchmarks. So these reports, like most FirePro reports, are quite flexible in terms of what data you feed into them. So I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of go through and talk about this in the context of what needs to happen. So first thing that we should point out here is that these reports are quite new. In order to use them, you should be using FirePro version 2.252 at least. We are trying to make sure this is sent out to everybody, and if you don't have that version, let us know. We'll make sure you can get updated to it. Anything past 2.252 will have the reports in it. But you definitely want to make sure you're using an updated version. Otherwise, the reports either won't be visible or won't have all the same features on them. Now, when we are working here, these reports are both reports that are run out of the incident reporting module, and they use the standard reporting functions. So the ones we're talking about here are called the apparatus response time comparison report from incidents and the new response time requirements report. So these reports are, like all reports in the FirePro structure, are going to be run off of the specific records that you're going to be looking at in the list window when you run it. So I'm just going to pop something up over here real quick. Oops, too many windows open. So when we are looking at those reports, we always want to be thinking about the incidents that we have selected to pull into the specific reports. So I know many of you, I think, were there for the discussion we had about like the NFPA 1710 and 1720 reports. A lot of those same principles of report filtering are still going to apply to these reports, in the sense that you don't really want to be running this for every single incident you have. It's really important to do some report filtering before you would want to go and run a report like this, especially since these reports are often, are pretty much always working with response targets and response performance targets. And there's many incidents that you go to that don't really fit the requirements of response performance. So there's a couple things that I would normally recommend before you start to run this report and look at the outputs, because they might not make great sense if you don't. So the first one is, it's really important normally to select a range of specific response types that you want to include. So in this case, I would use the chosen response type parameter, hit build list, and I would grab the specific response types that I want to include here. And it may well be that you're going to be running this similar report for several different data sets. I want to pull this particular report for fires with a specific set of response targets on it, versus maybe other types of calls like medical calls and things like that. So picking a specific set of response types is usually a great place to start with this report, because it's going to take your larger set of data and pull it down into a more targeted set. The other thing about these reports is that they are working primarily off of response times, usually on an individual firefighter basis or on an individual apparatus basis. So it's a good idea, before you start running these reports, to take a little time and review your data for what I like to think of or call outliers. So many departments are going to have specific calls that, because of a combination of factors, result in weird statistical information, really long response times because of something to do with dispatch or how they were paged out. So normally what I like to do is, once I've pulled a big filter down, I like to use my response time comparison report and my personnel on scene columns so that I can take a look at this. Specifically, the response time requirements report, that report is actually going to be looking for the number of personnel on scene based on their response times. So reports where you don't rise to the level of minimum number of personnel are not usually going to be particularly helpful to include in a statistical report like this. So in many cases, what I will also do in this context is I will go in and use, in our details section, there's a filter that lets me search for reports based on the number of responders that we had. So if I'm doing something like a, say, 10 firefighters in 10 minutes report, it might make sense for me to only filter for calls where I had 10 firefighters respond. Otherwise, the others are essentially automatic failures. Now, if you are trying to see what the overall numbers would look like, or for other calls, you may want to do something different there. But normally I would do something like this, where I set a floor for number of responding personnel so that I can essentially say, okay, these calls would meet the criteria that I'm trying to accomplish here. We can also see that for some of these calls, there is no calculated response time. And this is kind of what I mean by outliers from this perspective. This means that for this particular incident, there was no arrived on scene time. Usually what that means is that in many cases, the call was canceled. So it's quite important when you are running reports like this to think about how your data is actually being entered, because in many cases, these calls you might not want to include them, and you might want to consider what response types you're using for these calls. Now, this particular report is an assistance, and we can see that from an A. So in most cases for these reports, I like to either eliminate assistance reports, or we'll talk about how assistance reports are considered in some of these reports. But in this case, we could say, let's eliminate assistance reports. Again, we can see one here where this call does not have an arrive on scene time. In our comments, we can see that nothing was found. So we want to consider here whether we should be flagging this as a canceled en route call, whether we should be filing this as a a canceled en route type incident, because it probably isn't one that we want to factor into this kind of statistical reporting. It's not as critical to bring it in. So this is what I mean by reviewing your data for what I think of as outliers. Likewise, we can see on some of these where my response time was 57 minutes, probably because it was very far away, or in this case, because I was going into another department's area to do mutual aid. These are, again, ones that we want to consider factoring out of your baseline statistics so that you can say, get an accurate read on what your responses are actually like for calls within your fire protection area that you're responding to in a relatively normal fashion. So it's usually a good idea before you start to run this report in great detail to look at your data in FirePro, give some thought to how it's being entered and what we're seeing there, because that is going to be directly reflected in the statistical results that you're pulling out of these reports. It's also not a bad idea, especially if you have multiple stations and you want to do station comparisons, to get all the basic parameters in that you want to factor in into the report, and then you can save that as a saved search using this green plus button in the middle of the incident. And we could say response time basic data. Because what you can do is once you've set the basic data on the response time, you could then do things like go in and further filter this by individual station if you wanted to run these for a single station. Alternatively, you could say modify your basic response types to ensure that you're getting the specific data set that you want for generating this report, or indeed both of these reports. Now, the first report that I want to talk about is the apparatus response time comparison report. So this report is set up to specifically use apparatus response time as opposed to firefighter response time. So it's going to be looking primarily at the on-scene times for apparatuses. So that would be, in this case, the arrive scene time versus the dispatch time. So the arrive on scene time is really what's an important consideration, or really a critical consideration for this report. This particular report is not paying particular attention to personnel. It's dealing more with apparatuses. So when I run this report, it also gives me the ability to pick which department apparatuses I want to factor into this report. And this can be really helpful if you are, wanting to look at your department's primary response, because you can select just your primary response vehicles. You can eliminate, chief vehicles or any other apparatuses that you don't really want to factor into this. Likewise, if you are just looking at a specific station, you might want to pull just the apparatuses from that station. So when you are setting up this report, you're going to want to select specifically what apparatuses from the department you want this report to factor in for first on scene, second on scene, third on scene apparatus. The report does not differentiate specific apparatuses when it is displaying the outputs. It just talks about how long it took for you to get the first apparatus on scene, the second apparatus, the third apparatus. So in this case, what we can do is grab a variety of apparatuses. And if we wanted to, we could also include aerials or other apparatuses in there. But in this case, I don't want to include things like command units, for example. What we can also do on this parameter screen is that we can set a response time target. So this is basically saying this is how long I would like to see for my target response time. In this case, we're dealing with a relatively rural department in terms of my data set. So I'm going to put a relatively long response time target. This is also something that you can work with if you are wanting to run this report for different incident sets, right? You might be looking at having a different response time target for your medical incidents that are inside your municipal boundaries as opposed to other vectors of calls. Now, this report is also going to automatically, if you want it to, include assistance reports in determining whether, how long it took you to hit your target for response times for different apparatuses. So in this case, what I can do is, if I select the default, which is include responding apparatus, it is going to look at assistance reports, look at the on-scene times from those apparatuses, and factor them into whether you're hitting your response time targets or how long it's taking you to hit your response time targets. So, that you can also decide to exclude assistance report altogether from the report, or to include them as a specific item. So these will give you slightly different results in many cases, but include responding apparatus from assistance reports is usually the default here. So once I run this particular report, it's going to give me a couple different sets of data. So first of all, it's going to go through all the selected incidents, determine if they meet the criteria for response, and then show me whether those individual incidents met the response time comparisons or did not, or sorry, the response time requirements or did not. So it's also going to generate for me a length of time that it took in this case for each incident to get the first apparatus on scene, the second apparatus on scene, and in some cases, the third apparatus, depending on the scale of the response. It's also going to tell you the difference between the first and second and first and third apparatuses, but the more important thing here is that it will also give you an average amount of time that it took to get the first apparatus on scene. And remember, when we're talking about apparatuses here, we're only factoring in the selected ones that you picked as part of this report. So we can also see how long it took to get the second apparatus on scene, and then it's going to generate an average amount of time for the overall set that it took. It'll then show you what your response time requirement that you set was and how many of those calls hit the response time requirement. What it then calculates is how long it would have taken you to get to 90% success. So in this case, at 39 minutes and 48 seconds, 90% of these calls would have met that the response time requirement. So it's going to give you a bit of a breakdown about how long it's actually taking to get to that 90% success benchmark. So this report, you might want to run in several different variations. So the other report that we have, and those features are really just an enhancement of the existing apparatus response time comparison report. This report was already something that was in FirePro. The next report is a brand new report. It is somewhat similar to the NFPA 1710 report, but it's slightly simplified in the sense that it has a bit less in the way of parameters. So this particular report deals primarily with number of responding personnel. So rather than apparatus on scene times, it is specifically looking at personnel on scene times. So that can be somewhat different. So in this case, when I pick a response time requirements report, it's gonna ask me how many on-scene personnel are required for this report and how many minutes for my response time breakdown. So in this case, I'd say I'm just going to use this as an example, 5 personnel in 15 minutes. So once I spit this out, once again, it's going to give me a fairly similar breakdown in terms of how these reports look. It's going to show me exactly which reports I was successful on based on the benchmarks, and then which ones we were not successful on. It's also going to show our averages for success and non-success, and then give you what amount of time it would have taken to get to 90% success rate for those personnel and time benchmarks. It's really useful, and again, we can see that most of the time we're trying to factor in just reports that have the number of targeted personnel. It's really useful to pay attention again to outliers when you're reviewing this report, right? This might have been a report that, because of how it was factored in, we might want to modify somewhat to ensure that it's eliminated from the data set. Likewise, if we wanted to do that elimination from the data set manually, we could, for example, sort by response time highlight all the ones that I want to include, and then I can not include certain ones in that report. So gives me the option of doing that. I can do something similar with personnel, but it's usually more effective and consistent to try to make sure that your rules for how you are setting response type, how you are determining canceled en route or not, are consistent, so that reports that you may not want to factor in are more or less eliminated automatically at the searching stage, as opposed to you having to manually go through them and pick out which ones you want. So again, if I rerun this report with less data in it, I mean, these only eliminating one incident is not usually going to have a huge impact on the overall response time. But if I said, let's go with 5 in 20, and see what that looks like, we'll see a substantially greater number have hit for a larger percentage of success. And then again, we can start to see what actual amount of time it would take to be at 90% success for those basic benchmarks. So these two reports are, like I said, quite new. If there's other factors and things that would be useful to include in them, or additional data, we'd always be happy to talk about that. But now would be a great time if you have questions about these reports. I did put everybody on mute just because fire departments are loud places, but if you want to unmute yourself or put any questions in the chat, we can certainly do that. I mean, I know I covered a lot of stuff in fairly quickly there, but I didn't want to get into really deep specifics, because different departments are going to be recording stuff in different ways with different requirements. So often the specific details of how you apply these reports are going to be different from department to department. So Vince's question in chat was, what version am I demonstrating? This version is 2.253. So this is I'm actually, this version's gonna be, nope, this is a release version. But 2.252 should include all these reports in it. I'm working in a development environment here, so I'm sometimes a little bit ahead of everybody else. But yeah, 2.252. If you need 2.252 to run the reports, just drop us an email at tech support and we'll get an update sent out to you. If you've already received it but haven't installed it, it's a good reason to get it installed. Okay. Any other questions? People want me to show stuff? Yeah, so 2.250, I can send you a 2.252 update. We're trying to get people caught up to versions, and you can install 2.250, Darlene, or we can send you 2.252 and you can install that instead. The 2.250 won't have these reports in it though. We also got a question in chat about, can you run a report to see what your ambulance response times are? The main question there would be, do you have your ambulances in FirePro as apparatuses? If so, then yes, you absolutely can do that. The process would just be to, when you go into the apparatus response time comparison report, pick the ambulances from that set. In those cases, I would also be going back and adjusting my build list. Yeah, so in that case, no. It's not going to be possible to use this particular body of reports, although we could look at putting something together that looks at a version that looks at ambulance on scene time. But again, that's going to be somewhat variable depending on what we get. Like because if we don't have individual apparatus records for the ambulances, then it's tough to see things like second ambulance on scene or third ambulance on scene. But drop me an email, Marcel, and I'll take a look at putting something together for just a quick breakdown of how long it's taking ambulances to get on scene if you have that time. Yeah, if you have 2245, drop me an email and we'll get you updated to the, yeah, everybody who's on older versions, drop me an email and I'll get you updated to the current version so that you can run this report. Just send it to support@fb2.ca and we'll get you updated. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording here. And once I figure out how to do that.